Nick, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you sort of got started, not just with V2, but sort of in business in general.
Yeah, I have a very unusual career, which I didn't realize until you actually look back at it. But I started my career as a manufacturing engineer, actually an aerospace engineer. So
Right.
I studied engineering. I went to Cambridge to study what I thought would be electronic and electrical engineering. And the way it worked, I got more interested in manufacturing. I was sponsored through university by British Aerospace. And I guess because as a kid, I was brought up in the services and my dad was in the RAF, I had an interest in aerospace and I thought that was going to be my career. But having worked in aerospace for a few years, I knew I was interested in manufacturing. I'd heard about an opportunity at Mars in a big chocolate factory in Slough in the UK. And I thought, well, I
Right.
can do manufacturing. And I put my hand up as a very young manufacturing manager, probably the youngest they've ever had. And I was put in charge of Bounty, Maltesers, and Galaxy
Oh, wow.
manufacturing. So I was probably the most ill-equipped production manager you could imagine, but I learned very quickly. I also learned very quickly that I was much more interested in ideas and in research and development and changing things than I was in manufacturing. So I kind of pivoted my career into things like so building a food factory in Holland, and then ultimately into research and development. And I ended up as R&D director for Mars in Europe.
Yep.
I always wanted to, I was based in Holland at the time. I wanted to travel further. And so I moved to Australia with my young family. And we set up in Australia 17 or 18 years ago as R&D director for Master Foods, and then R&D director for PepsiCo, developing all sorts of lovely snacks and drinks, things like Red Rock
Yep.
Deli and Sun Bites, Grain Waves, extruded snacks. And that was kind of what I thought my career would be. But about 7 years ago, I was actually made redundant from PepsiCo. PepsiCo centralized their R&D back to the US,
Okay.
even though in Australia we actually did some pretty amazing innovation. And I was left with a new career, which was essentially as a consultant to big food companies on their R&D strategy. I did that together with Cambridge University Institute for Manufacturing. But I also taught innovation at UTS. So we started a degree, and I was like the practitioner, if you like, the innovation practitioner, part of a degree called Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation at UTS, which has
Right.
since really flourished. It's now a really important part of the UTS setup in sort of transdisciplinary innovation. And that was where I was up until about 4 years ago, when I was asked by some connections from the CSIRO and also from venture capital if I would like to do a bit of consulting to look at this plant-based meat
Yeah. Right.
thing that seemed to be happening around the world. And the question was, is there something that we could do in Australia? And that was about 4 years ago. I took a look at it. I said, this is something that is really important to get right. It's from a planetary sustainability perspective, it's probably the biggest thing that needs to be done. And basically, I was asked if I would start a company, which I did on the 17th of January, 2019.
Okay.
And that was the start of V2. That date sticks in my memory because that's the date actually when a really pivotal piece of which was published called the Eat Lancet report. And what the Lancet report did, it basically looked at how do you feed 10 billion people on this planet in a way that meets their nutritional needs. But for the first time, it coupled that with the planetary boundaries. So the idea that we have a finite amount of resources on this planet.
Yep.
And if we exceed those resources, we will be depleting the planet, and it has no good. There's no good outcome.
Yep.
Climate change. So it's the same sort of thinking as you've got in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And out of that report, it kind of said, well, the amount of meat that we should be eating per capita on the planet is something like 14 grams. And then if you look at your diet and my diet, and you look at your recipe books and you think, well, okay, where does it say take 14 grams of meat? It just doesn't fit.
Is that to be sustainable? Is it? Is that the
To be
figure?
sustainable, to meet,
Right.
to
Okay.
stay within the limits of the boundary. And this is because meat is so inefficient. It uses so much land. It uses so much resources in terms of, fertilizers, and its outputs in terms of methane are really so dangerous from a planetary warming perspective that it's been calculated that if we only ate 14 grams, we would be fine. But the trouble is that the majority of us eat more than that. And I mean, the average citizen on the planet eats only about 40 kilos a year. We eat about 120. But those who are eating 40 want to eat more. And as they get more wealthy, they will eat more meat. And that's the lived experience everywhere on the planet. There's no exception. Maybe India slightly under performs in terms of its meat consumption because of cultural influences. But basically, as we get richer, we eat more meat. And China is a case in point. And this is where it really does get terrifying. China's gone from about 5 kilos 50 years ago to 50 kilos of meat per person. 5 years ago, that was when Xi Jinping has said, we've got to halve our meat consumption. He's looking at how does he feed 1.4 billion people with, and it's clear that they're right up against, they can't actually produce the pork that they need to feed the population. In the time that he said it, in those 5 years, consumption's gone up from 50 to 60. And Hong Kong is 130. So if you multiply those number of kilos by 1.4 billion people, we have a serious problem. We will not be able to produce that meat. It doesn't matter how much of the Amazon we destroy to grow more feedstock, we will run out of capacity, and the environmental effects will be disastrous. So meat is really the kind of the elephant in the room. It doesn't get talked about, but it is about a third of the problem. And it's just beginning to be recognized in, the scientists obviously know what about it, but politically it's been very difficult to talk about. There's a lot of interests in this space. So it's only now sort of getting into the food systems discussion is only just getting into the UN COP discussions. And luckily enough, it is actually happening now, but it's, oh goodness, it's slow.
What's the biggest pushback you see from a production point of view in terms of the consumer or interest groups even? What's the biggest hesitancy or?
Well, there's a few things. One is it's very easy to sort of dismiss this as a sort of a vegan niche. And to be honest, V2 is not, whilst we're very happy that our product's vegan and the vegans like our product, we're really focused on mainstream meat eaters. That's important because most of us are meat eaters. Even if you ask the median vegan in the world, so why are you a vegan? They'll probably say, I'm not. I'm poor. We are omnivores. We like eating meat. So the job to be done is to have something which is a real alternative to meat, and that means it's got to be affordable. It's got to be delicious. No compromises. It's got to be as delicious as meat. We buy food according to our taste buds. Always have, always will. But it also has to be available where you buy your food. So in Australia, it's got to be available in Coles and Woolies, and it's got to be sort of mentally and physically available. If you can't find it on the shelf, you're not going to buy it. So actually, that's probably the biggest constraint that we've got. It is one that we're overcoming. I mean, that's a matter of distribution, weight of stock on the shelf. And in the 2 years that we've been in retail in Australia, we've gone from nowhere. We weren't on the shelf 2 years ago to being number one. And we're just getting to the point where people can see us. It's the lived experience of most people is, that's interesting what you're doing. Where can I buy it? And I'm kind of going, well, it's been in Coles and Woolies for 18 months, but you still haven't seen it. So clearly we're not as visible as we would like to be. From a other constraint, I mean, there has been a little bit of sort of lobbying from some interest groups to try and restrict labeling, for example, of plant-based meat. But to be honest, the weight of opinion is that this isn't a threat in a way to the meat industry. We're doubling our meat consumption. We can't do it from animals. Let's figure out how to do it from plants, because that's 30 times more efficient making meat directly from soy than feeding the soy to a cow. It's just an efficiency problem. And then if you think about it, that 30 times as much land, 30 times as much water, 30 times as much fertilizers and all of that stuff, you can restore that land back to other uses which are better for the planet. Carbon sequestration, forests, biodiversity, all of these things that we've been destroying over the last 40 years.
Yep.
If we're more efficient, we can give that back to the planet. And that's kind of, the big picture thinking behind V2 is how do we change the way we make our meat?
Yep.
Not eat less because we want to eat more, but we make it in a much more efficient way so that we can restore the balance on the planet and hopefully start halting, stay within the 1.5 degrees, which is just about within reach, but frighteningly close from being outside of our grasp now.
Yeah. So in terms of, this is all driven by effectively the population. Is to feed the population, we have to find other ways of doing it, right? If the population was far lower, that wouldn't be something we need. As in far lower, as in a fifth of the size or whatever it might be.
Someone has done a calculation that there is a sustainable human population based on nothing changing and us eating what we are today, hunter-gatherers. There is a number which kind of says, well, okay, a billion people on the planet would be sustainable. I'm not sure what the number is, but it's much, much lower than where we are today with 8 billion people. We've crossed that boundary and it will be 10 billion. So look, there's no future where the population on the planet is going to go down. I hope. Let's face it, that's not going to happen. So our job is to make food much more efficient, and animal-based meat is the biggest problem that needs to be solved.
Okay. And let me ask you a dumb question here that you've probably had lots of times, but I don't really know a lot about it. I've never tried it, which will now be on my list to try. But what is it? How is it made? What is it? It is actual meat? Because a lot of people probably have this. If I'm thinking like this and I don't know, there's going to be a lot of people that think like this. What is it? Actual meat? There's a lot of
actual meat. So what is it? It's made, we make from soy and other ingredients. Nutritionally, it's very close. So we match meat in terms of the major nutritional blocks. That was one of the first projects we did with the CSIRO, was to say, what should we be if we're going to match meat? We want to be, if we're going to take meat off the plate and replace it with V2, it's got to be as nutritious. So same amount of protein, same amount of amino acids, the same, building blocks that we value meat for. Similar levels of iron, zinc, B12. So that's a formulation exercise.
Yep.
In terms of sensory experience, it's got to have the same yumminess. Meat is delicious. It's sort of, I don't know, if you imagine how you feel when you bite into a really delicious, juicy burger and it's sort of fatty and you've got those meat flavors and it's chewy and you've got to recreate that really intense sensory experience. So that's a job to be done. And there's a lot of technical parts to that. You've got fat systems, you've got protein systems, you've got texture systems. There's flavor chemistry that happens in meat when you cook it. So, imagine the steak on the grill and then it starts to sizzle and then you start smelling that sort of burnt flesh smell. And you start salivating. So recreating that chemistry using plant-based materials, you can do it. And that's part of the science that we use CSIRO for. They're some of the best meat scientists in the world. They've been helping the meat industry for 50 years. So we're using a lot of that science to recreate the sensory experience, but do it in a way that's efficient and made from plants. And that's kind of the science behind V2. A lot of different technical projects that we've been running. And we're pretty damn good. I mean, if you eat a V2 Whopper in a Hungry Jack's or a Burger King, you will have the full Whopper experience. It
Yeah.
is delicious. It's smoky. It's you have a Whopper and it's
Yeah.
delicious. And when you buy mince, you can cook it the way you cook mince to make your favorite dish. And in Australia, that's going to be a spag bol or a chili conch or a maybe now a
Yeah.
sanchoy bao or something like that. But what we're trying to do is say, don't change your diet.
Yeah.
You like to eat the foods that probably your mum taught you. You're not going to change your diet. You might change a little bit on the edges, but basically you're eating the same stuff as your parents
Yeah.
ate. That's a human thing. Everywhere in the world, people kind of copy what their parents taught them to eat. Very good idea when you're a hunter-gatherer, because you're probably not going to poison yourself by eating something random. But that's kind of genetically wired in us. So again, from our perspective, let's solve the problem for people the way they are, give them
Yeah.
the food they like to eat, but let's make it in a much more efficient way. And I think that's probably a kind of like a human-centered design approach.
Yeah.
Designers don't sort of look at humans and ask them, what would you like? Because then you start thinking about it. What they do is
Yeah.
they watch people, watch what they do, and then design systems to fit around the way we are, not the way we would like to be. And I think that for us, that's an important learning.
Well, that's the old Henry Ford quote, I think, where he said, if people asked me what they would have wanted, they wouldn't have said a car, they would have said a faster horse or something along those lines, isn't it?
Yeah. The
Something
human
along
need
that.
is delicious food that you can
Yeah.
cook and that you share with your family. You know, it's the experience you want. And then our job is to fit in with that experience. And meats, let's, like it or not, people like meat. So let's deliver the meat that they like. And in Australia, it's beef mince. In China, it's pork, pork
Yeah.
mince that goes into steamed buns or into meatballs. And what we will do is we will supply the meat so that it will be locally relevant, So what we will sell in Ghana will be different than what we sell in Beijing and what we sell in Sydney. So,
and from a business perspective, obviously you've spent your career broadly across food and innovation in food. So obviously this fits, but running a startup is very different, I imagine, to what you've previously experienced. What's been the biggest surprise that you've seen as you've sort of gone into that startup that you've come across?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was teaching innovation, I was sort of kind of teaching how to be an entrepreneur. So when you're in a big corporation, you're fighting the system. Corporations don't like to innovate. The whole purpose of a company really is to replicate. The thing that somewhere in the beginning of a company, there was someone with a great idea, but basically once you've had that great idea, what companies do is they just replicate. Don't muck it up with pretty much the mantra in large companies. So being an innovation specialist in a big company was really hard work. You had to fight, you had to go underground, you had to go guerrilla, you had to almost avoid the immune system that was trying to kill you. And that was lived experience for probably 25 years in large corporations. And I must have nearly got fired numerous occasions. Now I'm going to get fired if I don't innovate. It's like, this is all about speed, all about rushing to the experiment that will prove whether it's a good idea or not. And then if it isn't, rushing to the next one. So the speed at which we're going is really quite breathtaking. I would have done, I imagine over the 4 years that I've been working on V2, I've certainly spent more money on R&D than I've ever spent in large corporations. But the volume of projects, I would have done more than 40 quite large projects in 4 years to unlock the technology that we need. I would have been lucky to have done 2 or 3 a year in large corporations. So very, very different. The bar that we set ourselves is so high. We put ourselves on an enormous amount of stress, but equally, we also have a mission that we all believe in. So chalk and cheese. My experience doing a startup is completely different from working in a corporation, and it has really good sides but I don't think I've ever worked as hard in my life.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Yeah. The nature of startups, right?
that's the nature of startups, and it's fun. I mean, the buzz is phenomenal. You get wins every week. You get wins. I've just been reviewing some results of some trials. I'm not going to go into the details, but one of our models, which is pretty important, as I said, I'm originally a manufacturing guy. When I was thinking about plant-based meat, one of the things I was thinking about is how are we actually going to manage a supply chain that's going to be really efficient and really cheap? Because, as I've said to you, no one's interested in paying more for meat. And one of the things that we do is we work with the meat industry. We go to a meat factory and we turn it into a plant-based meat factory. And so I was just reviewing results from, we went into a meat factory somewhere in the world where we're not today, went in there, did 4 trials, and in the space of 3 hours, we've just made 4 different products with our ingredients in a meat factory the other side of the world, and we're ready to go. So I can scale because I can use meat factories anywhere in the world. And that's kind of part of our proposition. And it's important because scaling is key. If we're going to solve this thing in a time frame of months and a few years rather than decades and generations, we've got to access the sorts of scale and capacity that is the current meat industry. And the best way of doing that is actually use the meat industry to do it for us.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Because you normally think that that would be seen as competition or whatever it might be, but to be able to leverage off existing systems has got to be a massive advantage in terms of going to market, right?
Yeah, and it's stuff that already exists. So you don't, to be honest, in some ways you could almost say, well, the science and technology behind the food science and the meat science, that's difficult, but it's kind of solvable. Building supply chains is really hard. There's stainless steel and there's trucks and there's systems and there's processes. That's stuff that you don't get right in a year. So if you can simplify that and use existing supply chains as much as possible, you can go a lot faster. And that was very much part of our thinking.
Nick, what's been your biggest strength in business that you've seen, and how does it help you succeed in growing the?
Well, I'm a CEO at the moment, but I've spent most of my life avoiding being CEO because I was much more interested in the ideas and in the innovation part. So I think, and obviously innovation and solving technical problems is a strength. I think now that I'm a CEO, I actually find that I'm having to make decisions which are not technical decisions; they're people decisions, or they're tough decisions around business model and making some tough calls. I find that very difficult. I must admit, that's not my go-to. My go-to is having an unsolvable problem and then finding a solution. That's what I do. So I think that certainly in the case of V2, that is a very useful strength. We know that we're not breaking any laws of physics. We know that most of these problems are solvable, and then it's just a question of belief that we can solve it. But I must admit, it's at the same time we've also got to create a viable business, and that's something I'm learning on the job. Luckily, I do have lots of really good people around me, and I've got some pretty strong sort of FMCG managers around me who can make sure that they compensate for my weaknesses. And I'm sure there are plenty of weaknesses.
Well, that leads to my next question, Nick, is what would you say your biggest weakness is, and how do you overcome that?
It probably, like I say, I think I'm all about the new stuff. So things bore me. So when we've got something and the problem's solved, then I lose interest. So what I need people to take that and run with it and then continuously improve it. So I need a really good team around me. And I think as business, actually, it's really important to have an innovation engine, but equally, once you've got to keep that going, but equally, you've got to keep the business on rails as well. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Quality Week, International Quality Week. And look, as an R&D director in big multinationals, quality is everything. You know that you are only one bad mistake away from destroying your brand always. So Now that might not seem sexy, but is seriously important. So I make sure that I've got the best people in our business to make sure that that is managed really well, because yeah, it's one thing inventing new stuff. If you muck up once, you can destroy your brand. So,
Yeah.
so what I try and do is compensate for the things that maybe I might lose interest in. I will obviously support the people who are doing that, but it's not the thing that necessarily I'm spending most of my time doing.
Yeah. And in terms of the product, is it, you've got, with the science behind it and the development and all that sort of stuff, you've got the product. Is it basically right? And the next part is really just getting adoption and sort of mass market, or is there more to be done in terms of the product?
There's more to be done on product. Unusually in food, you often spend about 3 or 4 years in R&D creating the product before you launch it, and then you spend the rest of your career stopping anyone from changing it. Basically,
Right. Yeah.
I can remember back in Mars when we would go back to the original recipe, and you'd make it up in the lab if you could. Difficult because the ingredients were different in the 1930s than they are now. But basically, your
Right.
job was to make sure that it never changed. That
Yeah.
matter. Now our job is to make sure that we get better every 6 months, and
Yeah.
because we're on this journey, we can get better. We are certainly good enough. Our product scores really well versus certainly all the competition, and scores really well versus meat. So we're certainly good enough, but I think that we can get better. And
Yeah.
we're a formulated product. The technology is evolving. We can get better. We can get cheaper. We can get more sustainable, and we can get more nutritious. And we've got programs working against all of those.
Yeah.
And it won't change. I think that there's going to be more. Sorry, it will change. It's going to
Yeah.
get better and better. And we've got roadmaps, for example, to get to carbon zero. We've got a very low carbon footprint today, about 2.2 kilos of carbon per kilo of meat, which is about 30 to 50 times better than beef, depending on where you measure your beef. But we want to get to carbon zero. So there's a whole roadmap. How do we get to carbon zero? How do we improve nutrition dramatically? There's some pretty big Western sicknesses out there because we don't eat enough fiber. So we're doing work on how is the fiber in our product relevant to the microbiome. So there's lots more to be done, and I don't think that we're going to be. So I don't think in 10 years we will be winding up our R&D and our science and technology development. There'll still be more to be done in 10 years' time.
Yeah. And from the business perspective, in terms of raising funds and the backing and that sort of stuff, you talked about CSIRO and some venture capital people. Can you go into any detail on that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So we've raised, so we started off with a seed investment from Main Sequence, which is the venture capital fund from the CSIRO. Pretty quickly, we went into, Series A and Series Bs. We've raised some hundreds of millions of dollars to grow the business rapidly, and we will continue to raise money. At the moment, we've got a fairly long runway, and that's pretty important because the investment environment has changed quite dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the last 4 or 5 months. But no, the intention here is to grow very, very fast. And if we just relied on organic growth, that would take decades to get to where we would want to be. We just don't have time. So the good news is there's a lot of investors out there who have also looked at the tea leaves. They know that this thing has to happen. There's a lot of investors out there that are called impact investors. They're interested in investing money in a way that's going to solve these major existential problems that we've got. They want to see impact. They want to see returns as well, but they want to see, what are we doing to carbon footprint? What are we doing to reduce the impacts of what we eat? And we have to provide evidence that we're actually solving that problem, as well as being a viable business that will give them some returns on their investment.
And that's a critical part, right? Is bringing the right people as investors, not just any investment, because this is critical.
It is. We want people to understand that what our mission is about, and to sign on to what we're trying to do, and to help us through it. I mean, the good news is a lot of the impact investors are also very well networked. They have a big set of people who might be able to help us. And when we when we do a round, we're looking for the sorts of investors that might be able to help us. So, for example, in the last round, Temasek was an investor, very well connected in Asia. We know that
Yep.
Asia meat consumption is growing dramatically. We need to be in Asia. So we were very keen to have investors that could maybe help us and maybe introduce us to some people that might be able to be partners, for example.
Yeah, okay. So it goes way beyond just having money invested. This is about opening up those supply chains as well, and markets, distribution, the whole thing, right?
The whole thing, yeah. And early investor was Jack Cowan of Hungry
Oh, yeah.
Jack's and Com Group, and very useful in opening up again the network. And we are really interested in investors that sign on to the mission and want us to be successful in achieving that mission.
So as you've gone through, what would be the best decision that you've made along the way? I mean, there's probably lots of different decisions, but is there any one particular thing that stands out that you thought, gee, I'm really glad that I went that way and did that, or anything along those lines?
I think the best decision was probably to position ourselves, or to think in terms of not plant-based meat, but think in terms of meat.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
You know, if we'd have focused on, you know, when I did my research on should we do something here, and I just focused on this sort of burgeoning alternative protein space, then what you do is you're kind of focused on a really small slice of the pie. And what I always thought when I taught innovation was, no, zoom out, look at the system and focus on the system problem. And so in a way, the downside of that is you actually get you kind of get an inferiority complex, because if you think about where are we in relation to meat, we're like 0.3% of market share. It's nothing. But equally, that means that we have enormous growth potential, you know, because we could get to 3% or we could get to 30%. I could get to 100x growth. And actually, that's what I need to do to deliver the mission. If I'd framed the problem around, well, we need to be a share of the alternative protein space, I'd probably be relaxing in my armchair now thinking, well, okay, we've made it. We're number one.
Yeah.
Which would be insane, because we have made no difference whatsoever on a planetary scale.
Yeah.
So I think framing up, and this is something that when you teach innovation, the most important thing is, how do you frame up the problem? And what is the problem to be solved? And luckily, we did that quite early on in the piece, and we realized that our role was to be a player in the meat industry and provide a more efficient alternative to meat, rather than just be a sort of vegan niche food company.
Yeah. And presumably as you look forward in terms of the decades, I mean, this becomes the mainstream. This is how people eat. This is meat in the future, right? This is not, I mean, no one wants to be the taxis when Uber comes in, you know, that sort of stuff, or there's plenty of other analogies. So you want to have, yes, it coexists and all that sort of stuff, and it does. But down the track, when you talk about sustainability and how things are done, the cost of doing it this way on a scientific basis is eventually, presumably, going to become cheaper and cheaper to produce, versus the opposite for meat from animals. So this is the future of the meat industry, not just a nice little niche. This is actually the early stages of how it's done.
I think so. I think that the fundamental economics and the efficiency, once we've solved all the problems, is very compelling. And we really cannot feed the planet if we carry on doing it the way we're doing it. So this thing has to happen. And then the question is who's going to make it happen, and how quickly can we make it happen? But you're right. It's a fundamental, in the same way that, I guess, you know, electric transportation is fundamental.
Yeah.
And you would hesitate to say cars, because it's going to go way beyond cars. It's, you know, transportation systems which are fundamentally sustainable will be the future. I do kind of reflect on, did Elon Musk at some point say, okay, what's the market for electric vehicles? Do we want to be a percentage of that? Because if he'd have done that,
different mindset, right?
Milk floats and golf carts, and say, well, maybe that's not an interesting area.
Yeah.
No, he was very much focused on not just cars, but on transportation. How do you
Yeah.
do transportation in a way that is consistent with sustainability?
Yeah. Massive difference in mindset, like you say. What about challenges? What would you describe as the most difficult challenge you've had as you've gone through this process? I imagine there's many, but what stands out as the most significant? How'd you overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you've got to get into the consideration set of consumers, so in a way that's a problem that I've always faced in food companies. It's always the same, how do consumers know about you? How do you get into the supermarkets? How do you negotiate all of that sort of really quite difficult environment? It's not easy innovating in food. So that's always been a challenge, but in a way it's kind of one that we've faced before. The difference is we're trying to grow 10x per year, and that's
Yeah.
something
Okay.
that doesn't normally happen in food. I think that pretty much we're going to be butting up against some real systemic challenges. So where is our protein coming from? How is it grown? Who controls the supply chain of the ingredients? And then we're actually butting up against some pretty powerful entities so there's going to, and we're beginning to see some of that now. So,
Okay. Yeah.
so disrupting in the whole food system is actually going to be quite tough. So that's part of the systemic change that we're sort of facing into. Where do we get our protein from? Maybe we have to extract our own protein. Maybe we need to invent some technologies that can do that in a better way.
Yeah.
So it's peeling the onion. You think you've solved some problems. We got meat on the shelf, job done.
Yeah.
Then you realize you've got much bigger problems to solve.
Well, it's incredible, isn't it? Because as you go back through the supply chains in various industries, you start to sort of, like you say, peeling back the layers of the onion, you realize just how, one particular, like oil is an example, in terms of if you go through supply chains, eliminating oil is a far bigger task than what people sort of think, because it goes through so many different parts of the supply chain. From, it's not just vehicles, it's the trucks that deliver things, it's in the products that are made. There's so many different layers to it, and presumably food, as you start to go through that process of the supply chains, there's all sorts of different factors and variables that come into it.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly if sometimes I do think about, imagine that we were successful and we were a significant proportion of meat. Some of the ingredients, for example, so we're working on coconut. So coconut fat is one of the ingredients in a lot of plant-based meat. And we're looking at this going, well, imagine we were successful. How would we get that amount of coconut? And we realize that that's actually going to cause sustainability problems, not today or tomorrow, but maybe 5 years down the track. So we're immediately thinking, okay, right, how do we then formulate? So we use other oils, which are easier to produce, but still have to get the same sort of fatty mouthfeel, because when you eat meat, you want to have that fat experience. If you don't have fat in meat, it tastes of nothing. You've got to get that.
Okay.
But then how do you do that without coconut? So again, as you think forward, you discover that there are other problems that you have to solve in the food supply chain. And that's part of what's actually interesting for me. I mean, I love solving, really difficult sort of innovation problems. And look, there's going to be lots of problems to be solved going forward.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, we're on the right track. We are, if we progress the way we're doing, we will actually be part of the solution. And that's something that is, it's good to know that we will be on the right side of history here.
Yeah. What was the best advice you were given when you went into business or during the process?
That's a really, really good question. I'm lucky to have some pretty good mentors, and they're diverse. So, for example, if I talk to Jack Cowan from Hungry Jack's, I mean, he's built his business over 60 years, the Hungry Jack's business, and he's pretty down to earth, rule one of business, stay in business, so, so that's
fairly practical.
Pretty good advice. Yeah. Don't go bankrupt. Yeah. That's pretty good advice. I think my chairman, Phil Moore, who's a partner in Main Sequence, I could be very worried about the fact that I'm not a CEO. I'm an R&D director, sort of masquerading as a CEO. And I could try and be somebody that I'm not, but I think it's important to be yourself. I
Yeah.
am who I am. There will be gaps in what I can do that others will need to fill, but I should accept that I have some strengths. I should build on those strengths, accept that I have weaknesses, but I've got to be honest to people about me. This is me. I'm doing everything I can to make this business successful, but I can't be what I'm not. So I just have to cover those weaknesses with others in my team. And
Yeah.
but if you're not honest with yourself and you're not actually yourself, then everyone is going to get confused.
Yeah.
I think if I was a hard-nosed sort of CEO, always focused on, on the costs and I would be terrible. I would do everything badly. So let's focus on your strengths.
Yeah. That's very good advice. Incidentally, we had Phil on the show about 2 weeks ago.
I'm sure he
Which
was absolutely wonderful.
He was great. What about business people and that probably goes into some of those people who are mentors, but what about business people that you admire, and whether they're local or overseas from afar? Anyone from an entrepreneurial point of view that
Yeah, it's very difficult. When I taught innovation, that was always something that we asked the team of students, and what I taught was transdisciplinary innovation. So we had, 20 different disciplines in the room. There were lawyers, there were engineers, there were scientists, there were journalists. And we asked them the question, who's your innovation hero? And they would all come with different people, and then what we would do is we would get them to exchange ideas about what has Florence Nightingale got in common with Albert Einstein, which has got in common with Nelson Mandela. I don't know. And what you do is you actually try and extract, well, what was special about these people? What made them stand out?
Yeah.
And I was, in the beginning, I said, well, my hero is Elon Musk. And that was kind of 7 years ago. And 7 years ago, not everyone had heard of Elon Musk,
Yeah.
funnily enough. Now I'm not sure whether he is my hero, but there are some aspects of what he does are just, it's just incredible how he imagines the future and then just puts everything in to
That
solving the
he can
problem.
execute like nobody else.
Yeah, so you can't really go past Elon Musk in terms of innovation hero.
Yeah.
I would like to think there are some aspects, some personality aspects, which I don't share with Elon Musk, but
He's slightly more controversial these days.
He's controversial, but look, he focuses on the problem and he solves it at speed. And I think certainly in our business, we don't have a lot of time to waste. So I think that's solving those fundamental problems at speed that's something which I think is heroic, and it's certainly worth trying to emulate.
Yeah. And what's next for the business? Where do you, in the next 5 and 10 years? Obviously, you're achieving the goals of what you want to do, but what do you see for the business? Is it what's next?
Well, yeah, we called V2 because it's sort of version 2 of the food system is what we kind of aspired to. The biggest problem is meat. I mean, let's face it. And in solving that, there are plenty of other sort of spin out technologies that we're developing that could be relevant to solving that problem. To be honest, my job is to solve the problem of meat everywhere in the world. And that includes not just developed markets, but includes Asian markets where the biggest growth in meat consumption is, but also emerging markets. We're doing work in Africa today to look at that whole emerging market, wet market scenario. The average meat consumption is not buying a pack of mince in Coles and Woolies. On a global level, meat consumption is killing an animal and butchering it and eating it within 4 or 5 hours without any refrigeration, without any killed supply chain. That's on average in the world. Well, how do we intervene and access a very effective supply chain, albeit it's not a supply chain that you might recognize in Australia? So we think that that's a job to be done again, and we're not going to run away from these challenges. It's a job to be done. It's a bit different and it's a bit more difficult. But that's the sort of thing that V2 needs to face into. And again, when I start talking about that, I get excited because that's another problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah.
We're not going to break any rules of physics to solve it. We think we can solve that one. And then it's going to be about getting the resources around that so that we can not just solve it in my head, but solve
Yeah.
it in the real world and then scale it. So that's kind of what V2 is going to be about. I sincerely hope that this plant-based meat thing will become a really big part of meat supply globally, and that V2 will be one of the players that make it happen. And that's the ambition. And if we're successful, then we can feed 10 billion people sustainably. And if we're not, then I don't really want to think about the consequences, because they're not
Well,
good.
something's got to give, right? In the end, something's got to give.
Something's got to give. But we're not going to wait for something to give. Our job's to make the future. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, perfect. Nick, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, lovely talking to you, Gio.